So yes, my name's Linda Hobbs. I'm from Deakin University, and I'm addressing the questions, what is out-of-field teaching and why is it so complex? So a lot of those issues that Anna looked at will, I guess, be touched on here again. So I'll address these questions by referring to a definition of out-of-field teaching that captures this complexity. So as is typical of many things education, this is a complex phenomenon because of why it arises, who it affects, and consequently the responses we need to deal with it. So let's begin by recognising that internationally there's no single definition of out-of-field teaching, mainly because who is counted as teaching out-of-field depends on the rules of the land as to what counts as adequate preparation for teaching and for teaching a subject. So there are different regulatory requirements, even across Australia, actually. And so we hope to highlight some of these differences at the summit. We need to appreciate that teaching out-of-field is a phenomenon because it's long-standing, it's observable, and it's widespread. But it can be represented in different ways as a product of the current profile of teachers in the system, as a problem of teacher distribution, as a crisis in teacher or teaching quality, as a product of inadequate school leadership practices, and as a product of inadequate resourcing of schools. So all of these issues will be addressed during this summit. They each pose complex questions involving different stakeholders to define the parameters of the problem and decision-making to produce multiple level solutions. So let's look at the dimensions of the phenomenon. It operates at a system, institutional, and individual person level. This schema, which was developed by Raffaella Porsche from Germany, highlights that at each of these levels there are certain conditions, processes, and effects that constitute the phenomenon. Often the commentary and research around out-of-field teaching focuses on the effects and at variables at that micro level. But hopefully through this summit, we can look more closely at that macro system level, such as policy settings and subject positioning, as well as the conditions that create the need for out-of-field teaching in the first place and the capacity for different stakeholders to respond. So in order to capture this complexity, I'll draw on research and work we did for the Victorian Department of Education to understand the phenomenon. But I would like to share two premises that underpin our work. The first is what it means to be a specialist. So the quote on the screen there is from Charles Sale's short story, The Specialist, from 1929, who's the champion privy builder from Sangamon County. So Gunther and I use this story in that book to illustrate what is at the heart of being a specialist. So to specialise means to become immersed and expert in a defined and bounded body of knowledge and skills such that there is coherence, flexibility in what is known and what one can do. There's refinement born from experience, and subtleties and nuances of what quality means permeates and is evident in the work produced. So for the subject specialist at school, having a history of learning, doing and using the specific disciplinary knowledge and skills through formal qualification provides at least a background to their teaching, but at most a filter that colours every pedagogical move. My second premise is that teaching is a learning profession. So teachers learn on the job, through experience and feedback, and within an environment where there is high teacher mobility, often from school to school, across teachers work across year levels, and often move from subject to subject. So then we need to think about what learning demands are placed on teachers when teaching out-of-field in these different spaces, but also at different stages of their career. So this then brings us to how we define teaching out-of-field. Last year, we were contracted to develop the definition of out-of-field teaching for the department, and the report's there, and Em's going to put it in the chat. The definition has two parts. some criteria, and then a multifaceted definition. So I'll go through those piece by piece. Through review of the literature and input by experts in the field, we identified a number of criteria that can determine what we define as out of field. So qualification comes from the policy context and determines what is a teacher qualified to teach. So alignment between a teacher's load and their qualifications. So this includes your technical alignment as well as specialism alignment. Also phase alignment, which refers to the level of schooling they're qualified for. Then workload refers to the conditions under which teachers teach and what allocation of out of field and in-field teaching maximises teacher effectiveness. So this includes what proportion their current and longitudinal workloads is out of field, as well as the stability of that load. So do they teach different subjects and year levels each semester, for example? Then the practice context refers to teacher capability. What is a teacher capable of teaching? Expertise and career stage come into play here. So these are measurable criteria, so are quantifiable to some extent. Then we have more self-report criteria. Teacher identity is the personal context. What does a teacher identify as? So there are a number of possible variables here, but commitment, self-concept and confidence are often used in research. Then structures mediate whether a teacher feels out of field. So how do school structures mediate out of fieldness? And this includes the school context and opportunities that are available or thwarted because of the pressures of teaching out of field, and the culture of support at the school. Then the last is a longitudinal criterion that focuses on pathways and the mechanisms that support teachers to move from out of field to in field. So we developed these criteria map and they're quite complex, but probably the key things that I want to focus on is what can we learn as stakeholders in this issue from these criteria. So the criteria and the dimensions that you see there are mapped as degree of alignment between a standard of what we want within the system and degrees of out of fieldness, which are represented here as 3 bands. So band 1 is mostly aligned, so essentially in field, and band 3 is least aligned. Of interest is how these criteria can inform different stakeholders' responses. So for these measurable criteria, the policies around specialist area guidelines, teaching qualifications, and accreditation and registration determine if a teacher is technically out of field or not, although there is a difference often between the regulations and what's accepted within schools. So for the composite subjects like science and the humanities, a teacher can feel near misaligned when actually teaching in field. For example, a science teacher with a background in biology feeling out of field when teaching chemistry. Teacher recruitment policies, which also often relate to the school autonomy, determine the conditions under which teachers are recruited. And some teachers are actually recruited to teach mostly out of field. And I've got an example of that. And often these are new teachers. While initial teacher education determines which phase or schooling level of a teacher, teachers are often required to teach across phases, especially in K to 12 or F to 12 schools. ITE also prepares teachers with particular methods, but sometimes these methods lead to teaching out of field. For example, in the humanities, where a geography trained teacher has to teach humanities and it's presented that way through initial teacher education. So these issues relating to ITE will be explored further during the summit. School leaders and teachers can have discussions about workload proportion and stability. As Anna's indicated, there should be honest discussion about suitability of a teacher to teach an out-of-field load. If not capability in the subject, then what other criteria are decisions based on? Also, career stage introduces a level of risk to a misaligned teaching load, and therefore should be factored into the decision making. Looking at the criterion map for the self-report criteria, it introduces questions around policies at the state and school level for supporting new teachers and teachers generally. But then how do these play out at the school level in determining support structures? What opportunities are available given the context, and how supported do teachers really feel? So these factors mediate actually whether a teacher feels out of field or not. School autonomy, funding arrangements, and how individual schools manage their own budgets determine how professional development is made available for teachers, and how mentoring and other expertise are brought in to support specific teachers. The teacher-related factors such as teacher commitment, self-concept, and confidence, all factors that contribute to teacher identity, give an important guide as to the effects of teaching out of field. Then the longitudinal criteria recognise that learning occurs over time, on the job, and that therefore there needs to be structures and programs in place to support teacher development over time. Whether these things are in place determines whether teachers will always be out of field technically, or if there is pathways for teachers to move further towards in-field. This, however, comes back to teacher commitment. A teacher may be committed to the subject long-term, or they could see it as a temporary assignment and therefore unlikely to undertake further studies or professional development. So this is where regulators and professional learning providers need to work together to make sure there are policies in place to provide, recognise and remunerate additional teacher qualifications for those who choose to transition to in-field. A grad cert gives teachers an extra qualification, but how does this get recognised within the system, apart from on a teacher's CV and selection criteria when applying for the next job? How we think about these things is influenced by what is culturally accepted within the system. Is it so important that teachers be qualified or not? Some school people would say no. They use other criteria to determine suitability and fit. Others would say yes, qualifications are always needed in some subjects. So this brings us to the definitions that we created using these criteria. We developed one in-field definition and then a multifaceted definition for out-of-field teaching as determined by qualification, specialism, workload, and capability. For the in-field definition, there are three combinations, similar to Paul Weldon's definition from the 2016 ACER report, but emphasising requiring a full minor rather than just one subject at the tertiary second level. That's in line with the specialist area guidelines that universities use to select students into different methods in Victoria. So the first is fully aligned, noting that the teacher qualification determines which schooling phase is in-field. The difference between 1 and 2 is whether there are methodology units or not. Then the third introduces in-service teacher upgrade, a grad cert, for example. But from my experience, this should also be coupled with relevant teaching experience. When we class these teachers as in-field, I suppose it can also be debated during this summit. So let's have a look at the out-of-field definitions by seeing how they play out with real teachers from research. So out-of-field, according to qualification, focuses on this technical alignment simply based on qualifications. We have Ian, who is a science and ICT teacher who's taught maths out of field his whole career and gained an additional qualification in ICT, but he still feels out of field in maths simply because he doesn't have that qualification. Then we have Betty, who is a phase misaligned teacher who's a primary maths specialist teaching year 7 maths. So that's the first year of secondary school, who felt teaching at the secondary level out of field because of the need for a completely different pedagogical approach. So there are pathways for both of these teachers, upgrades, professional learning, for example. Then also determined by qualifications, out of field by specialism includes technically out of field and out of specialism teachers and or loads, and this can be classified as near or far misaligned. That's using the language of Julie Luft from America. We have Eliza, who feels out of field in some science disciplines, despite being in field according to the specialism guidelines, actually. And a psychology teacher, Cyril, teaching maths and feeling in field, but technically out of field and out of specialism due to the far misalignment of science and psychology. Out of field by teaching workload or their teaching allocation refers to the amount and stability of an out of field load. So this recognises that a teacher will teach multiple subjects at any one time, probably. So according to their teaching load, how much is in field and out of field? This definition introduces levels of risk and manageability. So how manageable is the load and what risks are introduced because of it? Out of field, according to workload, recognises that as a small proportion and stable amount of out of field teaching will have less risk than a high proportion and unstable out of field load. So here we have Kate, who is in her first and second year of teaching with medium then high levels of risk because of having such a high proportion of out of field load, which changed from one semester to the next. And she actually had to leave that school to even teach in field. Then we have out of field according to capability, which can lead to a teacher feeling out of field or out of capability as determined by their expertise, confidence in what they know and can do, and often a sense of re-novicing, which is a Blazer concept for more experienced teachers. So re-novicing, feeling like they're a novice again. This is a question around whether there's a question around whether teachers expand their role or not to include the new subject. So a teacher might say, I'm a science teacher now, and the kids see me as a science teacher. This is quite a comprehensive definition that includes many of the criteria. It introduces the idea of cumulative risk as determined by the school support and context, teacher's career stage, and the workload of the teacher. This definition can include pathways to in-field because of that fundamental focus on teacher capability. So if we look at Donald, he's a design and tech teacher teaching art, literacy support and work studies with no in-field classes, an unstable load. He's from a rural school with a small rural school with limited support and few opportunities in terms of advancement or professional learning. While committed to his students, he had limited support and little time for expanding his expertise and sense of self in relation to these subjects. Spread thin, you might say. So low capability and high risk. So what are our takeaways from this complex approach to defining out of field? We need a language about out of field that is more than a statement of whether the teacher is in or out. So this introduces the language of alignment, capability, which is not fixed but can change over time, and risk and the reality of cumulative risk. And we should think of this risk in terms of current and ongoing load. So what happens longitudinally for a teacher? We have different labels. Linda. Thank you. We have different labels that can serve different purposes. How could these be used by a teacher or principal to determine levels of risk for a teacher and pathways for developing teacher capability? And how might the department and other subject associations use these criteria to inform their data collection and decision-making about programs and initiatives tailored for out-of-field teachers. It therefore takes account of the need for clear pathways from out-of-field to in-field and the various organisations that can provide these opportunities. It recognises that this is not just about the teacher actually, but that a supportive school culture is a mediator for determining whether somebody feels the effects of teaching out of field. And finally, the definition provides a language that can be translated into policies and frameworks that govern school recruitment, allocation, and professional development practices. Okay, so now it's over to you to share your insights into why teaching out of field is so complex and how to better define and understand the phenomenon. Thank you very much for your time today.